The Earth-Zyran alliance had always been a fragile thing, stitched together with diplomatic meetings, trade negotiations, and the unspoken understanding that neither species trusted the other completely. Humanity had met its fair share of alien species over the years, but none had inspired as much awe or intimidation as the Zyrans. Towering, physically powerful, and bred for war, they were a civilization of warriors, rulers, and conquerors. That they had chosen peace with Earth rather than subjugation had been considered a blessing. Among them was Queen Zalvanna, the reigning matriarch of the Zyran Empire. At 8 feet tall, she was an imposing figure, with indigo skin that gleamed under the artificial lights of the embassy's grand hall. Her silver-white hair cascaded in thick braids down her back, adorned with bands of dark metal that signified her status. Long, elegant limbs bore the muscle of a trained warrior, but her true strength lay in her gaze, those piercing, elongated pupils that cut through deception with a single look. She carried herself like the living embodiment of her people's pride, her movements graceful yet commanding. Dorian Hayes sat among the Earth representatives, watching her with quiet interest. He had been assigned to the Alliance as a cultural liaison, a bridge between humanity and their alien allies. It was a role that required patience, intelligence, and an ability to navigate delicate situations. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, but Zalvanna was a mystery. The discussion that day had shifted toward an unusual topic, the future of their species. Talks of genetic compatibility had arisen, a matter of growing importance as both civilizations sought to solidify their long-term partnership. Some suggested experiments, controlled breeding programs to see if Zyrans and humans could produce viable offspring. Zalvanna had laughed, a rich, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber, drawing attention to her. "Breed with a human," she said, amusement clear in her voice. What an amusing concept. The other Zyrans in the room smirked, exchanging glances with one another. Humans were a fascinating species, resilient, creative, and unpredictable, but they were also fragile, small. Their lifespans were barely a fraction of a Zyran's. The idea of producing hybrid offspring seemed ludicrous. Dorian tilted his head, studying her. "You seem awfully sure that it wouldn't work." Her gaze flicked to him, curiosity sparking for the first time. He wasn't like the other humans she had encountered. He didn't flinch under her scrutiny, nor did he fidget like so many others did when speaking in her presence. There was an ease to him, a confidence that bordered on defiant. "I am more than sure," she replied smoothly. "Our physiologies are too different. Zyrans do not produce offspring easily with even our closest genetic relatives. The idea of a human and a Zyran creating life together? Impossible." Dorian leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. "That sounds more like an assumption than a fact." She arched a brow. "Are you challenging my knowledge of my own species, human?" "I'm saying that, historically, what's considered impossible tends to change when someone actually tests it." His lips curled into a smirk. "Maybe you should test that theory." For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Then, a slow smirk pulled at the corners of Zalvanna's lips. "You are bold." He met her gaze without hesitation. "I've been called worse." There was a flicker of something in her expression, something unreadable. The meeting continued, but the energy between them had shifted. Over the following weeks, Dorian found himself encountering Zalvanna more often, sometimes in formal settings, where they debated human and Zyran relations. Other times, in less official moments, passing one another in the embassy corridors, exchanging glances across the room at diplomatic gatherings. He wasn't sure why she intrigued him so much. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, so utterly sure of her own strength. Maybe it was the rare glimpses of amusement she allowed herself when he challenged her. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something unspoken. One evening, during a reception held in honor of an upcoming trade agreement, he found himself standing at the balcony overlooking the city. The embassy was in the heart of New Vienna, a metropolis rebuilt after the chaos of first contact. The lights stretched far into the horizon, humanity's tenacity reflected in every towering structure. "Humans build fast," came a voice behind him. He turned to see Zalvana stepping onto the balcony, her long coat draping over her shoulders. The deep violet of her formal attire shimmered under the ambient glow of the city. "We have to," he said. "It's how we survive." She regarded him for a moment before stepping beside him, her height making him feel oddly small in comparison. "I have been thinking about what you said," she admitted. Dorian arched a brow. "You'll have to be more specific." "I say a lot of things." She exhaled sharply, the closest thing to a chuckle he had heard from her. "About the experiment." He turned to face her fully. "Oh, I do not believe it would work," she said, her voice calm. "But it is true that many things once deemed impossible have become reality. Science is full of such discoveries." He watched her, intrigued. "Are you saying you want to test the theory?" She met his gaze evenly. "I am saying that I am not so prideful as to dismiss a challenge." Dorian smirked. "That's the most roundabout way of saying, yes, I've ever heard." Zalvana let out a soft, amused huff. "I am not accustomed to being questioned so freely." "I think you like it." She tilted her head, considering him. "Perhaps." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the city stretched out beneath them, the distant sounds of laughter and conversation filtering from inside the reception hall. Finally, Zalvana reached out, her fingers grazing the fabric of his sleeve. It was a simple gesture, yet coming from her it felt monumental. "You understand that this is not casual," she said. "If we proceed, it will be with intention." Dorian's smirk softened into something more genuine. "I wouldn't expect anything less from a queen." Her lips quirked upward before she stepped back. "Then we shall see if humans are as adaptable as they claim." With that, she turned and strode back into the reception, leaving Dorian standing on the balcony, heart pounding in a way he hadn't quite expected. Their first meeting in private was arranged with the precision of a military operation. Zyran customs dictated that courtship, if it could even be called that, was to be handled with discretion, especially for someone of Zalvana's rank. The idea of a human consort, even for an experiment, was something that would raise eyebrows across both civilizations. Dorian arrived at her quarters that evening, uncertain of what to expect. He had seen Zalvana in many settings, commanding, amused, distant, but never like this. She stood before him, clad in something simpler than her usual attire. The warrior's regalia was gone, replaced with sleek, dark fabric that clung to her form in ways that made his throat dry. "You are nervous," she observed. He chuckled. "You're a queen. It's not every day I get summoned by royalty." She stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. "This is new territory for me as well." Dorian met her gaze, sensing the weight of this moment. "Then we figure it out together." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, together." As she reached for him, he realized that whatever happened next wasn't just about science or diplomacy. This was something more, something neither of them had been prepared for, and neither of them would leave unchanged. The days that followed were unlike anything Dorian had ever experienced. He had expected something clinical, perhaps a calculated test to satisfy Zalvana's curiosity. Instead, their interactions carried an intensity he hadn't anticipated. There was no denying the chemistry between them, but it was more than that. She was a queen, a warrior, a being bred for command. And yet, behind the calculated demeanor, Dorian saw something deeper. A curiosity she had long suppressed, a side of her that had never entertained the possibility of true connection with a human. Their first night together had shattered expectations. What had begun as an experiment quickly turned into something neither of them could dismiss so easily. Zyrans were a race of control, and Zalvana had always prided herself on being a master of discipline. But with him, she found herself unraveling in ways she never had before. Dorian, for all his smaller stature, was unshaken in her presence. He didn't submit to her authority the way others did. He challenged her, teased her, met her in ways no Zyran male ever had. It was exhilarating, infuriating, and addictive all at once. But even as the nights passed, and their connection deepened, Zalvana remained wary. One evening, as they lay together in the dim glow of her chambers, She traced a hand along his chest, thoughtful. Do you understand what this means, human? Dorian, still catching his breath, smirked up at her. That you can't resist me? She scoffed, but there was amusement in her eyes. That you are reckless. You do not consider the consequences of what you start. He propped himself up on one elbow, watching her. I know exactly what I'm doing. Her expression shifted, her long fingers brushing absently along his arm. This is not something I can take lightly. Dorian studied her, sensing the weight behind her words. Are you saying you regret it? She hesitated. No. He reached up, brushing a strand of silver-white hair away from her face. Then what are you afraid of? Zalvanna did not answer immediately. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her elongated pupils narrowing in thought. You will not live as long as I do. Dorian chuckled, shaking his head. That's what's bothering you? Her sharp gaze snapped to his. You find that amusing? I find it interesting, he admitted. You're worried about a future that hasn't even happened yet. She fell silent, her fingers tightening slightly against his skin. Zyrans do not form bonds carelessly. If I take a consort, it is for life. I cannot afford attachment to something temporary. Dorian's smirk faded slightly, his expression softening. Zalvanna, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Maybe not everything has to be permanent to be worth having. She didn't respond right away, and he could see the war waging behind her expression. He had never met anyone like her. So powerful, yet so guarded. Finally, she exhaled. You are an infuriating man, Dorian Hayes. He grinned. And yet, here you are. She shook her head, but the hint of a smile tugged at her lips. Their time together continued, but with it came the reality of their situation. The whispers had started. Court officials and Zyran delegates had noticed the Queen's absences, the subtle changes in her demeanor. Some suspected the truth. Others merely speculated. One evening, as Dorian made his way through the embassy corridors, he found himself intercepted by a Zyran noble, Lord Vikresh, one of Zalvanna's advisors. You should be careful, human, Vikresh said, his deep voice carrying an undertone of warning. Dorian arched a brow. That sounds like a threat. The Zyran's pupils narrowed. It is a fact. You may amuse the Queen now, but she is bound by duty. You are not one of us. You will never be. Dorian's jaw tightened. That's up to her, isn't it? Vikresh studied him for a moment before shaking his head. You do not understand what you have started. With that, the Zyran turned and walked away, leaving Dorian with the uncomfortable sensation that things were about to become far more complicated. That feeling only deepened when, days later, Zalvanna summoned him to her chambers. There was something different about her. Her normally composed demeanor was strained, tension evident in the tightness of her jaw. We need to talk, she said. Dorian stepped inside, frowning. What's wrong? Zalvanna hesitated before looking him in the eye. I believe I am with child. Silence. For a moment, Dorian thought he had misheard her. But the look in her eyes told him otherwise. He swallowed, his mind racing. You're sure? I have not confirmed it with the medics yet, but I know my body. She crossed her arms, exhaling sharply. This should not be possible. Dorian ran a hand through his hair, trying to process. But it is. She nodded slowly, the weight of the realization settling between them. Finally, she turned to him, her voice quieter than before. Dorian, what do we do? He looked at her, this powerful, indomitable queen who had once laughed at the very idea of such a thing. And in that moment he realized something. This wasn't just about an experiment anymore. It never had been. He stepped forward, placing his hands on her waist, grounding them both. We figure it out, he said simply. Together. For the first time, she did not argue. She simply let him hold her, and for once, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, impossible things could happen. The revelation of Zalvanna's pregnancy changed everything. Dorian had thought their relationship was complicated before, but now it was something else entirely. The Zyran queen, fierce, untouchable, the symbol of her people's strength, was carrying his child. A child that shouldn't even exist. For the first few days, she kept the information to herself, refusing to see the medics. Whether it was denial or simple caution, he wasn't sure. But Dorian knew one thing. She was afraid. Not of the pregnancy itself, but of what it meant. Of how her people would react. Zalvanna had spent her life upholding the traditions of the Zyran Empire. As queen, she was expected to take a mate from one of the noble bloodlines to ensure the strength of the next generation. A hybrid child was unprecedented, unplanned, unacceptable to many. "You should not be so calm," she told Dorian one evening, as they sat in the quiet of her chambers. He glanced at her from his place on the couch, stretching an arm along the backrest. "Should I be panicking?" "Yes." She paced across the room, her movements sharp, restless. "This will not be received well. My advisors will demand answers. The noble houses will see it as a disgrace, an insult to our lineage." Dorian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And what do you see it as?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening into fists at her sides. "I do not know," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know this wasn't what either of us planned, but it's happening. And I'm not going anywhere." Her gaze snapped to his. "Do not make promises you cannot keep." "I don't make promises lightly." His voice was steady, firm. "I'm here, Zalvanna. I'll fight for you, for our child, if I have to." She stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. Then, finally, she exhaled and sat down beside him. "You are impossible." He grinned. "I hear that a lot." For the first time that night, a faint smile touched her lips. The moment of truth came sooner than expected. Zalvanna could not hide her condition forever. She had summoned her most trusted physician, a Zyran medic named Varesh, to confirm what she already knew. The examination had been brief but conclusive. "The child is strong," Varesh had said, his expression carefully neutral. "But there are abnormalities. The genetic blending is unlike anything I have seen before." Zalvanna sat stiffly on the examination chair, her expression unreadable. "Will it survive?" Varesh hesitated. "I cannot say for certain. Zyran births are difficult even under normal circumstances. Your body is adapting, but this is uncharted territory." Dorian stood nearby, his arms crossed, his heart pounding. "So what do we do?" The medic inclined his head. "I will monitor the pregnancy closely. There is no precedent for this, but I will do everything in my power to ensure the safety of both the queen and the child." Zalvanna nodded, her face betraying no emotion. "Thank you, Varesh. This conversation does not leave this room." The medic bowed slightly. "As you wish, my queen." Once he had gone, Dorian turned to Zalvanna. "Now what?" She closed her eyes briefly before standing. "Now we prepare." The news spread faster than either of them had expected. Rumors turned into whispers. Whispers turned into outcries. The royal court demanded answers. The noble houses called for an investigation. The very idea of a hybrid child, a blending of Zyran and human blood, was met with disbelief, then outrage. At the center of it all stood Zalvanna, unyielding. She had not risen to power by cowering before the expectations of others. She faced the council herself, standing tall before the gathered nobles, her voice unwavering. "I have chosen my path," she declared, her piercing gaze sweeping over them. "This child is mine, and I will not be dictated to on matters of my own blood." A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Lord Vikresh, the same noble who had warned Dorian before, stepped forward, his expression cold. "My queen, surely you understand the consequences of this. A hybrid child is an unknown variable. There is no telling what it may become." Zalvanna's eyes narrowed. "Then we will find out." Another noble spoke up. "The people will see this as weakness. A queen bearing a child with a human. It is an insult to our heritage." Dorian, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. "Funny. I thought strength was about survival, about pushing beyond limits. Isn't that what the Zyran Empire prides itself on? The nobles turned to him, their expressions a mix of disdain and wariness. You overstep, human, one of them growled. Dorian met his gaze without flinching. Do I? Or are you just scared? He glanced around the room. You act like this is some kind of catastrophe. But the truth is, this is evolution. You don't know what this child will become. You're afraid of what it represents. Change. Silence stretched between them. Zalvanna's lips twitched slightly, the barest hint of approval. Lord Vikresh exhaled sharply. This will divide our people. Then let it, Zalvanna said. The Empire has survived worse. The nobles looked among themselves, uncertainty flickering in their expressions. They could not defy their queen outright, but the unrest was undeniable. As the council dismissed, Zalvanna turned to Dorian, her gaze unreadable. You enjoy provoking them, he shrugged. I like watching them squirm. She shook her head, but there was amusement in her eyes. Despite the opposition, the days passed. Zalvanna's pregnancy progressed, and the truth could no longer be hidden from the public. Some viewed it as a disgrace, others as a curiosity. But there were those, both Zyran and human, who saw it for what it truly was. A new beginning. Dorian stayed by her side. Through the whispers, the uncertainty, the moments of doubt. He saw the way she touched her stomach when she thought no one was watching. The way her fingers lingered there as if she still couldn't believe it was real. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, she finally spoke the words she had been holding back. I am afraid. Dorian turned to her, surprised by the admission. Zalvanna was not a woman who admitted fear easily. He reached out, covering her hand with his own. Me too, she exhaled slowly. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if this child will survive, or if I will. Dorian tightened his grip. Then we take it one day at a time. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was meant to be, and that, despite everything, they would find a way forward. The months passed faster than either of them had anticipated. Zalvanna's pregnancy was unlike anything the Zyran medics had ever seen. Her body, designed for the endurance of a warrior queen, was forced to adapt to something completely unknown. There were moments of difficulty. Times when even the most advanced Zyran technology struggled to keep up with the changes happening within her. But despite every challenge, she endured. Dorian never left her side. He had fought battles before, against nature, against enemies, against the odds. But this was different. This was the fight of his life, the fight for the family he had never expected to have. And then, one night, everything changed. The pain came suddenly, sharper than anything Zalvanna had ever felt. It stole the breath from her lungs, made even her formidable strength falter. Dorian was there in an instant, catching her before she collapsed. Zal! She clenched her teeth, gripping his arm so tightly, he could feel her claws pressing against his skin. It's time, she ground out. The palace was thrown into chaos. Medics flooded her chambers, voices overlapping as they prepared for a birth unlike any in Zyran history. Dorian refused to leave. No. He snapped when one of the attendants tried to usher him away. I'm staying with her. The physician hesitated, glancing at Zalvanna. She barely had the strength to speak, but she managed to nod. He stays. And so he did. The hours that followed were a blur of tension, pain, and sheer determination. Zalvanna, who had never backed down from any battle, faced the greatest test of her life. Dorian held her hand through every moment, whispering encouragement, grounding her, refusing to let her fight alone. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sharp cry split the air. A child. Their child. The room fell into stunned silence as the medics carefully lifted the newborn, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Dorian barely remembered moving, barely registered anything else as he stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. The baby was small, far smaller than a typical Zyran newborn, but undeniably strong. a delicate blend of their two species. Tiny fingers, dark violet skin like Zalvanna's but with softer human-like features. And when the infant opened its eyes, Dorian saw a striking contrast. One eye a deep Zyran gold, the other a piercing human blue. The impossible had become real. Zalvanna, exhausted but still every bit the warrior queen, slowly reached out. The medics placed the child in her arms, and for the first time, she looked truly vulnerable. She stared down at their child in silence, her sharp, calculating mind momentarily stunned. Then, slowly, something softened in her expression. Something Dorian had never seen before. Pure, unguarded love. He sat beside her, his hand covering hers as they both looked down at the tiny life they had created. "What do we call them?" he murmured. Zalvanna was silent for a long moment. Then, with a rare, genuine smile, she whispered a name. A name that blended both their cultures, both their worlds. A name that signified a future neither of them had expected but now couldn't imagine living without. Dorian smiled. "It's perfect." The aftermath was not without its challenges. The nobles still whispered. The political tensions still simmered. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because the people, the ordinary citizens, both Zyran and human, saw what the nobles could not. They saw hope. They saw a future where their races were not separate, but intertwined. They saw a child born of two worlds, a symbol of something greater than war, greater than fear. And slowly, the tides began to shift. Zalvanna remained queen, her rule unchallenged. Those who had doubted her strength now saw something undeniable. She was not weaker for choosing love, for choosing Dorian. She was stronger. Dorian, once just a human out of place in an alien court, found himself something else entirely. He was no longer just an outsider. He was family, a father, partner to a queen. And when he looked at Zalvanna, when he saw the way she cradled their child, the way she looked at him with something softer, something real, he knew this was worth it. Every fight, every challenge, every impossible moment. Because in the end, against all odds, they had found something neither of them had ever expected. Love, a future, family.